Yeah, go ahead. There we go.
Okay, so we broadcast. So from now, it's New Zealand chapter's time. So John's gonna introduce something from New Zealand. So yeah, please go ahead, John.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the beginning of the second half of our inaugural OWASP Chapters All-Day event. My name is John DeLeo, and I'm one of the chapter leaders here at OWASP New Zealand. Before I turn the time over to our speakers, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about OWASP New Zealand itself. The chapter has been around since 2007, and it was actually started by a few volunteers, including one of our current chapter leaders. We are a single chapter for the whole country, which is a family of 5 million, and located here in the beautiful subtropical island nation of New Zealand, where we are happy to report management of the current health crisis has been actually done very well, and we are looking forward to quite possibly going back to normal, but with the borders closed in a week. Here at the chapter, we have 3 active meetups in the 3 largest cities in the country, Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch. We are working on organizing another meetup in the lovely southern city of Dunedin. However, that of course has been on hold since in-person meetings have been suspended. Last year, we also introduced a couple of new activities, which we were hoping to repeat this year, having some local training days to do weekend training presented by local professionals. And Kirk, one of our speakers today, created the security.ac.nz conference, which is student-focused, to introduce information technology and computer science students to the practices of InfoSec and AppSec. So last year we had a really good conference, and thanks to this generous support of our sponsors, we were able to make the 2-day weekend conference at Victoria University in Wellington completely free. So we're hoping to repeat that sometime later this year. We currently have 3 chapter leaders. I am the chapter leader in Auckland. Kirk, one of our presenters, is the chapter leader in Wellington. And then Kim Carter, one of our founding volunteers, is the chapter leader in Christchurch. Now, our flagship event has been the OWASP New Zealand Day Conference, which is an annual free conference held in Auckland. The first time it was held was in 2009, where we had about 150 attendees in a single 1-day track. Our most recent conference, held this past February, had 800 attendees present. We had 3 tracks going, in addition to 2 days of pre-conference training with 5 classes presented and trainers coming from all over the world. Now, we are still planning to hold our next event. It's the 14th to the 17th of February of 2021. Unfortunately, the postponed Global AppSec Dublin now coincides with those dates. I know that a number of folks have been debating whether their conferences are going to be virtual or not. At this point, our plan is that this will be a face-to-face conference. However, we may see some attendance limitations, and we're expanding the pre-conference training option to include remote presenters of online training, so that folks who aren't able to travel to New Zealand can still present training. That was really all I wanted to tell you about the chapter. And at this point, it is my privilege to present to you our first speaker, Erica Anderson, or Spatina, who is going to talk to us about some of the small free things that we can do to help out those small organizations that we interact with and possibly support and volunteer with. Erica?
Cool. Thanks, John. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Erica. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you all. And hello from New Zealand, from Wellington. Excellent. So the whole point of this talk is, I know a lot of us will likely volunteer with small groups. So this talk isn't focused necessarily on large organizations. It's not probably focused on your day-to-day job. Of course, there's still a lot of things that you can learn here and take away from that. But really, the focus of this is to help those small organizations. Now, just to briefly introduce myself, I work for a company called SafeStack, but most people in New Zealand and most people online probably know me based off a lot of the other things that I do. So I work with a whole bunch of organizations, including the one on my shirt, so KiwiCon, helping run a community conference. So I spend a lot of my time with groups such as Code Club Aotearoa, Space and Science Festival, Good Bitches Baking, and also the conference that I run with a bunch of really good eggs called KawaiiCon. So in terms of my specialty, obviously I'm a security nerd by day, but I really aim to support the communities in my spare time. And these organizations are what you would define as, I suppose, perpetually small. So, they're not meant to, these organizations aren't going to be the next startup that's going to take over the world. These organizations likely aren't going to scale outside the communities that they support. They're what we call perpetually small. So the whole focus of this talk is to really explain some of the ways that we as security professionals or as security experts can kind of help these perpetually small people. Because at the end of the day, they still need a lot of support and they still need a lot of love and care. So for the focus of this talk is going to be largely around, in your local communities, you're going to have family businesses, whether or not it's the cafe or the dairy down the road, or it's a restaurant or a small sole contractor that kind of run their own trading business. It could also be your community groups. So it could be, your local OWASP chapter. It could be perhaps the local community groups that you get involved in with your friends and family. But it could also be any of your side hustles or your side projects, because we still use technology with these things, and we still need to be really mindful of how we protect them. And a lot of the experience, just to kind of explain a bit more as to why we care so much about these things, is as part of my day-to-day job, I focus solely on helping small, medium businesses, also a few large ones, but trying to help those small organizations thrive and allow them to focus on what they do well and not have to worry too much about the security thing, because they're not big enough to have those big security teams or those experts at the organization that do security. But also, I come from a lot of experience of previously working for organizations such as CERT New Zealand. So within New Zealand, that's the Computer Emergency Response Team. A lot of you all within your countries probably also have CERT teams. But here in New Zealand, they're a little bit special, and they actually receive reports from anyone in New Zealand. So not necessarily just organizations that are big and mighty and take up a whole bunch of resources and really fuel the countries. But within New Zealand, CERT New Zealand receive a lot of reports from individuals, small businesses. They get a lot of reports, and what I've found, and the thing that really kind of touches my heartstrings, is when you see those small organizations that are just trying to do the best that they can, but unfortunately they get caught in the big wide net of security attacks. So the reason why I put together this talk and collated some of these security controls is because when it comes to those small organizations, we really need them. Right? So we need them to survive. These small groups, although they're not going to take over the country or the world with their ideas, we need them because they promote all of our local economies. They stimulate local businesses, they give people jobs, they give people a sense of community and a sense of belonging. And it helps us develop our people and our communities. Those small organizations, those perpetually small groups really kind of give back to the community in large ways, and in ways that perhaps a much larger organization or business can't. So we need to keep them alive. We need to keep them going and humming, and we need to protect them from the badness that they could get caught up with. And of course, there's always that feel-good factor, right? So the whole reason why I spend a lot of my spare time working with organizations and running conferences and doing all of this stuff is because, there's that little warm, fuzzy feeling that you get on the inside. And all of us are security experts, and we could all do, if we all just kind of chipped in a little bit of time to help that small community group or to help that person who's running that side project, you can really kind of help them get higher up that, the pyramid of, in terms of like the pyramid of protection, and you can remove them from that low hanging fruit aspect and remove them from getting caught into some of those much wider nets of security attacks. Now, obviously, when it comes to these organizations, obviously they have a lot of really good things that they do, but unfortunately, as I mentioned, being small isn't all roses. Unfortunately, when I've talked to a lot of these small organizations, one of the first things that they get surprised about is that, why did I get picked up in this security incident? Why did my website get hacked and is all of a sudden hosting phishing pages, or is all of a sudden performing attacks against other people's websites or resources? Like, why was it me? I'm so small. And especially, you see this a lot in New Zealand, but I'm sure in your countries as well. There's that thinking that, by having an online website or by using online tools to run your business, there's still this concept of, well, I'm just a small fish in a really big pond. Why am I getting caught in this? And actually, so sharing some data from the CERT New Zealand team, they produce a quarterly report every quarter, and it provides some detail in terms of what we see in New Zealand and how a lot of those small organizations, or any organization, are getting attacked. And really, the top three categories that we see within New Zealand really kind of relates to phishing and credential harvesting. So obviously, we see New Zealand sees a lot of phishing attacks, and either that's people within the country receiving those and actually falling for those and accidentally giving over their usernames and passwords, or also we see a lot of website compromise of local New Zealand businesses that are then hosting those phishing pages that might be used to attack other people outside the country. So that is actually one of the top incident categories, and I'm sure it's very similar to a lot of you overseas as well. We also see a lot of scams and fraud. Predominantly in New Zealand, we see a slew of invoice-related scams where, unfortunately, people get access to those email inboxes and are able to modify invoice details. And unfortunately, paying the wrong invoice for a small company, or not receiving, or having one of your vendors fall for an invoice scam can have huge, massive detrimental impacts to you as a small group. And then, of course, the other top three, the third one in the top three is unauthorized access. So that's getting into unauthorized access, whether it's to your email or to your website or to any of the systems that support your business, and losing access to those, which can then cause harm. So it's just to like dive into those a little bit more. Obviously, a lot of us think about security incidents from a much bigger scale. So, for example, at CERT, they've had, in the quarter that we're looking at here, which is the summary from 2018, there were 37 reports about different types of malware variants. So, we're getting into the good, for those of you who are listening and are security people, we're getting into the good, interesting, juicy things relating to, particular types of malware families. We're getting into Gozi and Emotet and Zeus, and it's quite fascinating. But, if we just take out the really cool, interesting context of what that means, really, when it comes to a small business, they don't need to care about what malware family it is. They just need to know how these attacks actually happen. And unfortunately, they happen quite often. Some of the most common ransomware variants that we see in New Zealand, for example, from last year in the quarter three, seeing lots of really common off-the-shelf stuff that, for us, we know a lot about these malware families because we can track them and we can stay up to date of what these people are doing. But unfortunately, when it comes to the end of the day, an attacker could still use a really old off-the-shelf type of ransomware that, sure, we might know heaps about and do all of this really cool research, but to that small business, if they're not just doing that one simple thing of using a unique password on their remote access, or if they're not running, the most up-to-date patch on their CMS system, it doesn't matter whether or not we know everything about the people who run that Dharma ransomware. They're still going to have a really bad time. So really, in other words, when it comes to the things that the small businesses are really scared about, it comes down to unauthorized access and malware. Those are two of the biggest things that, unfortunately, a lot of perpetually small organizations get hit really hard with. Unauthorized access, what I mean about that is a lot of the time, perhaps the website that they use to host their, static, even a simple static marketing site, something that perhaps doesn't have a lot of data on it, it can be used to then attack others, which damages their reputation as someone who is using that IP address or using that domain. It causes them to have negative consequences to their, I guess, technological assets, right? But also for those websites, perhaps you're running a small side business. Thanks for all the comments. I just switched over to live comments, so thanks for the cool t-shirt comment. Sorry, getting distracted. But from an unauthorized access point of view, if you're running your side business and you are collecting information from your customers, or if you're running a simple e-commerce site to maybe sell your art or sell different things, and if that website were to be compromised, you're going to have a really bad time of perhaps having like credit card skimmers. And it doesn't have to be the most up-to-date, most advanced type of, 10 minutes left. It doesn't have to be the most advanced type of malware, but if it works and for that small business, if they're not keeping up to date and keeping, if they're not keeping up to date on their security hygiene, then they're going to have a bad time. And then when it comes to malware, so, they commonly get hit with known and common variants of malware that is constantly reused and self-propagating, because a lot of these organizations can't afford the privilege that a lot of large enterprises have of having, antivirus and anti-malware on their systems. And some of them might not actually know how to perform a backup or whether or not a backup is important. Enterprises actually have those medium and larger sized businesses, and enterprises have a massive advantage. And although it might not seem the case of, if you're a small business, if you're like a medium-sized business owner or work for a large organization, you're probably sitting in the seat of, well, we don't get the support that we need from a security point of view. But you're actually in a much more privileged spot than some of this perpetually small organizations. For example, as an enterprise or a small, medium business, your organization might have some type of host protection to protect against known malware, or you have the enterprise tools to be able to deploy those type of things. And you might be able to deploy anti-malware across devices that you own. And the third thing, which is the most important, you can hire people such as myself to come in, stop some of those problems. And that's what I do for a living. I come into organizations, we call it our Mary Poppins as a service, in a really, loving way. We come in and we help people fix things. And this is actually the advantage, because those larger organizations can do that. But if we're looking at our small organizations, they don't have any resources, right? So they only have the resources to run their actual business function. Whether or not that's running that small side project, or if it's providing that local contractor service. They only have what they have to do that thing. And they often rely on volunteers and other people to actually make that mission happen. Such as, people such as myself. And a lot of the times they're not technical folks. And unfortunately, we see a lot of fallacies whenever I work with these perpetually small groups, thinking that they're too small to be attacked or too small to be noticed, or that security is too expensive. But what I'm hoping to do and hoping to share with you all is to share some of those tips that will kind of elevate them from getting caught in a lot of those, common known variants of malware or common types of unauthorized access, and kind of just step them up so that they can keep doing all of the good things. Excellent. But yeah, so security doesn't have to be too expensive. There are plenty of 3 things that people could do. You just need a little bit of time. So something that I've put together is this blog series. You can find it on our safestack.io website, but it basically talks to those people. It talks specifically to those perpetually small folks and talks to them about how to do security when you're small. And it really ultimately comes down to knowing the accounts and the technology that you use, making sure you're always using unique passwords to protect against some of those, password spraying or brute force attempts using leaked passwords, and using multi-factor authentication, even if it is SMS. And I know that we all have opinions about this, but some MFA is better than no MFA at all. So making sure you have MFA on those really high-risk accounts, making sure you're doing backups and you're storing those off of your actual, network, so that it doesn't get caught up when a ransomware attack takes over your network. And then configuring automatic everything. Automatic patching, so you don't have to worry about it, and it doesn't have to keep you up at night if all of a sudden there's this big, Windows vulnerability that's in the paper, or the big, vulnerability that they're reading about in the news. They don't have to worry about it because they know that they've taken those steps early. So what we've put together, you can grab a copy of it at the link below, but it's basically just a quick asset list. And it's a resource that they can print, that a perpetually small group can print out, and they can fill it out for themselves, so they can start to take literally an inventory of their digital assets, the same way that they might do inventory of their physical assets, and going through and actually making sure that they've keeping track of, their email, their social media, anything that's money related, anything that is related to hosting their website, anything for hosting and storing documents. And it's hopefully going to help them go down that journey of, well, if everything is on this one little asset list and this one sheet of paper, you can start visualizing and saying, okay, well, which of these is so critical to me that if I lost it, I'm going to have a really bad day. Then they can go to the next steps of, setting up MFA for those accounts, and you can kind of start them down on that journey. And I'm running short on time, but I'm just going to quickly wrap up. Sharing is caring. So if you are, all of you obviously spend time with OWASP, you're likely really keen on helping small groups or working within your community. Highly recommend sharing sharing some of these guides and some of these things in the blog around how to do the small thing and how to spend just a little bit of time every couple of weeks to improve things, and sharing those with some of the small organizations or the perpetually small groups that you live with and that are in your communities. And last but not least, although I don't work for them now, I'm still a huge fan. So CERT New Zealand, even if you're not in New Zealand, they have some really fantastic guides to explain a lot of these concepts to people not like us, to people who are non-technical and whatnot. So definitely share those links, take a look. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach me on Twitter or shoot me an email. But that is me. Cool.
Thank you so much, Erica.
Yeah. In terms of my favorite type of bug, I don't know. That's a hard one. I have seen my fair share of a whole bunch of different, ransomware or phishing kits and stuff, but I can't say I have a favorite. They're all equally terrible, but fun to look through, I think. Cool.
All right.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Excellent.
All right. We'll now transition to our second speaker, Mr. Kirk Jackson, one of my fellow chapter leaders here in New Zealand. Kirk currently works at Red Shield in Wellington, and he leads our meetup in Wellington. And he previously was an organizer of the OWASP New Zealand Day conference, although he very kindly allowed me to step in and take the reins there. Today he's going to be presenting a talk entitled "Let Me Secure That For You." So the question is it possible to wrap security around an already existing but insecure website. Wouldn't it be great if we could do that? So Kirk's going to introduce the concept called virtual patching, what kind of issues can be addressed that way, and look a little bit deeper into some things we can do with content security policies. Kirk?
Thanks, John.
I think we may be having an audio problem.
Hello, can you hear?
There we go.
Ah, okay. Is it still staticky or?
Now it's we're getting some popping, but otherwise it's sounding pretty good. And we've lost audio again.
My apologies for that. Is this microphone better?
That is much better. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm sorry, everyone. Well, it's a bit awkward, but I'll do the introduction the third time. Hey, everybody, welcome along to New Zealand's Hour. If you've been online for all the 13 previous hours, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you're going to do the marathon the whole way through, let us know. It's been great to hear from some voices from different countries in the previous hours, and I know that there'll be some good talks coming up. So my name's Kirk. As John said, I volunteer with him in the New Zealand chapter organization, and since he's way more organized than me, John's taken over a lot of the conference organization duties, actually all of them. Great. So what am I going to talk about today? So I'm going to talk about securing applications after they've been built. So let's start the story with building a secure web application. So you've got this great idea. You think you can help people. Like, wouldn't it be great if people could add items to a to-do list and we could store it from them in the cloud, and then when they're at the supermarket buying their groceries, they can look at the items on their shopping list, or when they're at work, they can tick items off the to-do list. So you've had this idea and it solves a real user problem. So you spin up a software development lifecycle. You're like, okay, now we're going to build this product. And you think, okay, well, it's obviously we need to put it on a web server. So we put our app onto a web server. We deploy it maybe by dragging a zip file over SFTP or maybe something a bit more sophisticated, and we're ready to share it with our customers. And that goes really well during our beta phase. And we think, well, customers seem to be enjoying using our to-do list app. We should probably start charging them for it. So we need to move it into production. And of course, you need a firewall if it's going to be in production. You need to have a production web server rather than just a server underneath your desk. But if you're going to start charging them for it, then PCI comes into play. And so you've got to put a web application firewall and a proxy and run antivirus on your web server. And now, is everything secure and ready to go? Can you launch to your customers? Well, I guess in your production environment, you need to have a configuration agent to make sure that your web server is configured correctly. And you need to have an intrusion detection system in case attackers break in. You need to have a data loss prevention system to detect any sensitive data leaving the environment via the proxy or otherwise. And you need to have an identity and access management system so that you can keep track of what users are actually able to configure your environment. And of course, all these things produce logs. So you need to push them all to a logging system like a SIEM. So now you're secure? Well, was the software even secure to start with? So let's look at our software development process. Well, our developers probably needed to have security training, and we probably needed to perform security reviews as part of our code review process, maybe some threat modeling to understand what risks our to-do list application would have. We might need to do a static analysis of the source code of the application, or maybe a dynamic analysis of the JavaScript code, and maybe even an interactive analysis of the code, so that we can see if there's any security issues as it runs, and then we can do some security testing. And now, is our application secure? Well, we could drop runtime application security protection in to our app server to try and detect issues at runtime, but we probably need to harden the operating system, and after we've built the web server, we need to make sure it stays up to date. So we need to have some kind of patch management process to make sure patches get applied. We probably want to have file integrity monitoring to make sure that there's no rootkits dropped in there or anything dodgy being uploaded to our web server. We've got identity, we've got people using our production environment. So we probably need to have some governance process around that to make sure that when people switch roles, their access gets removed. When new people come, people leave. So let's try that. Okay, what about configuration management? We need to keep track of, cloud workflow protection. Oh my gosh, now are we secure? Oh, we need to automate our app releases, and we need to monitor all these systems, because what good is a SIEM if it's not actually tracking events from our environment? And what good is an environment if it's not up? And we need to have policies that inform our teams that we need to put all these things in our environments and what our procedures are in order to meet those policies. So now, are we secure? Well, we get our first customer and they say, oh, sure, you said you've done all these things, but have you got any independent proof that you've done that? And so you need to vulnerability scan your environment internally and externally to check if it's fully patched. You might hire someone to do a configuration review and say, yes, your production server is hardened in the proper way. You might get some penetration testing who can test your application from outside and see, does it really work the way you say it works? And is there any security issues that haven't been thought of? And then, of course, the ultimate test, which is the attacks that come in. Do they succeed, or are you blocking them? So now, are you secure? Well, we think we've built our software securely, and we think we're hosting it securely, and we've had someone verify it's secure. And this was quite a process, right? And it's probably pretty expensive to do so. So have we done everything we need to build a secure web app? Well, we've probably done everything that, the various checklists would say we have to do. And all those things we've done, if we didn't do one of them and we got breached, someone would probably say, oh, it's because you didn't do interactive security testing, or you didn't do penetration testing. So we think all those things are necessary, but is our web application actually secure? What if there's a bug? I mean, every software product has bugs, and some of those bugs are security issues. Well, if we're lucky, our web application firewall might stop things like SQL injection or cross-site scripting. But what if there's a business logic bug, or something that none of our layers of security will block? Well, then we have to release a new app release. So we have to go around our software development lifecycle with updates to it. We have to deploy it. Hopefully we've got automation so we can deploy it under urgency with confidence. But releasing updated software is expensive and it takes time. So, the to-do list application team might have moved on to the next product that the company is going to sell. Or maybe we've let the developers go, or maybe it was outsourced software. Even if we want to build a new update to the software, we have to do a whole bunch of source control and continuous integration tasks, such as branching and merging and building a new version of the software. We have to test it, which may be a manual process. Depending on your company, you might have a release management process where you need to go through a change review board. And then you're ready to release. And how long does that take between you knowing about a security issue and you being able to release? It can take hours, days, weeks, potentially even months for some businesses to be able to release a new version of their software. And even if you have the source code, it could take time. But what if you don't have the source code? What if it's a legacy application? And what process do you need to shortcut in order to do the security release, to do the security update to your software? Like, if it normally takes you at least a week to get a change through the change review board, but if there's a security issue, you can expedite that. Maybe we should be expediting everything, but that's a different question. But how do you get software updated, and how much does it cost your company? And so this is a big problem, and people have been grappling with this for a long time, longer than I've been in the industry, is how do we release updated software quickly and securely? And the question you might ask is there a way we can patch the issues on our software without touching the underlying website? So can we quickly fix security issues and then let the software development catch up? And that's a concept called virtual patching. So virtual patching, the idea is to prevent the exploitation of a known vulnerability. So you know about an issue, it could potentially be exploited, and you want to prevent it by patching it. Now, there's a really great cheat sheet on the OWASP cheat sheet series website, the virtual patching cheat sheet, and it talks about what virtual patching is. And in my mind, virtual patching is really an agile security approach. It's a way to fix security issues in a quick and nimble manner. It's probably not agile as in the Agile Manifesto, but agile as in nimble or quick. It's something that the security team or the infrastructure team can potentially do to fix insecure software in lieu of the software development process catching up. It lets the team react quickly, and then later on you can fix the issue properly. And if you want to do virtual patching, it's best to be prepared in advance, because you don't want to be learning about these new techniques in the middle of a data breach or in the middle of a security incident. And that's really what this talk is about planting that seed in your mind that maybe this is something you should be prepared for. So virtual patching is really a layer that sits in front of your web application. And commonly, you'll use a web application firewall to do this, such as Mod Security or another product. And if you have that there in advance, then you're able to say to the business, hey, let me secure that for you. I can fix this issue while the software is released and updated and released. So you might have this red blinker going, you say the word WAF and a lot of people get upset. And it's due to these experiences that they've had. Like, their users hate the WAF that they currently use because they're always getting blocked by false positives. And the developers hate the WAF because it slows them down every time they want to release a new feature. That feature doesn't work due to the WAF. Or the sysadmins hate the WAF because they have to tune it constantly. And the security team hates the WAF because actually it doesn't fix real vulnerabilities. And a lot of these things are true. And so you have to think about the way you put your WAF layer in place. So if you want to do virtual patching, you want to be able to have a layer sitting in front of your website in advance of when there's an issue, so that you can go and do your virtual patches when there's an incident or a security issue. So you want to be able to put it there in advance, but you don't want to break the applications. So you want to have the WAF sitting there either in transparent mode or in a very minimal set of blocking setup, so that there's a very low chance of false positives. And then you can show the team that it's not the WAF that causes issues, it's how it's configured. And we'll talk a bit about mod security in coming slides, but mod security and the core rule set is a nice baseline WAF deployment that doesn't introduce new issues, has a very low false positive rate. So you can put your WAF in transparent mode, you can set it there, and then when you have an issue, all you're introducing, if you want to do virtual patching, is the bare minimum patch that mitigates the issue. And we'll talk a little bit about what those could be. So introducing the core rule set. So I'm not a contributor to this project, but it's a great project. The OWASP mod security core rule set project has, oh man, it's a mouthful, has released version 3 a while ago, and now they're up to version 3.4. And it's a bunch of WAF rules for mod security. And these rules are quite high quality. And there's been a lot of thought go into how to make rules with minimum false positives. So the base set of rules only block real attacks. And the rules are so good that other software products use them as well. So you'll see the same rule sets available in AWS WAF, the Azure Web Application Firewall, and Fastly, Oracle Cloud, Cloudflare, WAFfuls. So a lot of these projects might not even be based on mod security, but they use the core rule set, or they provide that for their users as an option. And I think that speaks to how high quality this project is. So what's mod security? People call it ModSec. Originally, it was an Apache module built by Ivan Ristic. And in version 3, it was rewritten into a standalone library with a connector that can support Apache and another connector for Nginx. And it's basically a web application firewall that supports configuration via these rules that you can write. It is quite complicated to get your head around mod security. The syntax for it sort of harkens back to its Apache HTTP module legacy. And so I recommend that you read a book, or at least that's the way I learn things. And the Mod Security Handbook, written by Christian Fellini and Ivan Ristic, is a really good introduction to how mod security works. So how does the mod security and the core rule set work together? Well, the core rule set has a bunch of rules that detect common attacks. So things that you'll know from your OWASP top 10, such as SQL injection and cross-site scripting, some more esoteric attacks, and the core rule set also has a bunch of exceptions to stop common products from being blocked. Now, most of these rules, or all of these rules, are tuned in order to avoid false positives. So on the whole, you can deploy them in a safe manner without blocking legitimate traffic. How it works is there's a bunch of different files that have rules for different types of attacks. So there you can see the different attack types, remote code execution, session fixation, etc., cross-site scripting. And as the request goes through mod security, it builds up a score of which rules have triggered. And as the response goes through mod security, coming back from your web server after the request is processed, it does the same thing. It runs the response rules. And what you can set up is basically different thresholds for blocking. So just because one rule triggered doesn't necessarily mean that the core rule set will block the request or trap the response. But you can set thresholds, and there's a couple of rules that evaluate basically the collection of rules that have already triggered and been logged, and decide whether or not the request should be blocked or whether it should be alerted. It's quite a nice approach. And why do you need a WAF? Well, why do you need the core rule set? Well, say someone said to you, could you stop cross-site scripting for me? These are the 27 regular expressions that the core rule set project used to block cross-site scripting. And wow, aren't they crazy? And a lot of these are actually generated by a machine to simplify the regular expression processing. So there's actually a lot more rules needed to block cross-site scripting. And if you had to do that yourself, boy, it would be crazy. But it turns out that even regular expressions can't actually block all issues. So mod security uses this library called libinjection for cross-site scripting and SQL injection as a further layer of defense. So in summary about mod security, why do we use it? Well, I think I've covered most of this. It allows simple things to be done relatively easily, but mod security does get complicated, which is why you need to think about this in advance. It's got quite daunting syntax. I don't recommend learning about mod security in the middle of a security incident. I recommend setting everything up in advance and having a few practice runs. And mod security can't do everything. So what are the sort of things that you as the security team or the infrastructure team or otherwise can do using a tool like mod security or another virtual patching environment? Well, you can do things like adding HTTP headers to responses. So you might be able to mitigate some simple attacks just by turning on the strict transport security header or blocking cross-origin requests. Back in hour 10, Walter did a talk on HTTP security headers where you can go and learn more about them. And I recommend these two websites as having good information about security headers. You might be able to do simple changes to your cookies, such as adding the secure and HTTP only flags, or strengthen the same origin policy using the _secure or _host prefixes on your cookies. Or you could do more complex fixes like removing cookies so that to prevent session fixation, or tracking which sessions the user is logged out from so that you can enforce logout in your virtual patching layer if the application doesn't do it. Or maybe even doing stronger authentication sessions, such as reducing the expiration time or detecting if a user is changing IP addresses and dropping their session. And you can also use the same site flag on your cookies to protect against some or most CSRF attacks in modern browsers, such as setting the same site flag on existing cookies, or maybe implementing a canary cookie that can detect when same site requests are happening. And hour 21, how many hours away is that? Yikes, it's going to be 8 hours. If you're still around then, or you can watch the stream later, Michael's going to dive into same site cookies. Other things you could do, so if there's just a particular parameter on a certain page that, say, is vulnerable to SQL injection, or you can do input validation against just that parameter with the confidence that you're not breaking the rest of the website. And oh wow, I called out hour 16's talk in a different way, but you can go and listen to that talk later on about different ways to do input validation. You can mitigate CVE exploits. So say you find out about a new attack in a particular product, say a Joomla or WordPress. You might be able to mitigate that by writing a rule, or you can perhaps even subscribe to commercial providers that sell, daily feeds of rules for CVEs. You could block certain IP addresses. You could block access to sections of your website, or you could implement a whitelist content security policy. So I was actually going to dive a little bit into content security policy in a few pages, but not as deep as Neil is going to do. Oh, sorry, has done. Man, all these hours. Has done in his talk earlier on, so you can go and look at that. In a virtual patching layer, you can implement a whitelist CSP policy, but it's quite hard to do a strict CSP policy. And John just points out that Neil changed his title at the last minute. So go looking in hour 11, and I hope that talk's there. So what can you do? Well, you should prepare in advance. So think about, do you want to do these kinds of virtual patches? How can you have your virtual patching layer ready to go, sitting there in line? Maybe test if you can have mod security sitting there, or AWS WAF, or some other product, all the time ready to go. Make sure it doesn't cause false positives. And then practice writing virtual patches. So in your downtime or in a period of no security incident, maybe you could practice, what happens if I have to apply SQL injection signatures to the username parameter on this application? Can I do that? Prepare the patch, sit it to one side, ready to use under urgency. So I was going to dive a little into content security policy, and here I'm just going to reference a talk I did at the OWASP New Zealand Day conference, which is a pick a path adventure. So some of you might have read this type of book as a child. And in this talk, it's sort of in a book style. You can go through the various pages of this book and decide how you're going to do content security policy. And because I'm running short of time, I guess I can't really talk much about how content security policy works. But the way I like to use content security policy is to prevent cross-site scripting. It does other things as well, but by adding HTTP headers to your responses, either in your application or using your WAF or your virtual patching layer, you can add an additional layer of defense to try and block XSS attacks. And if you've got the source code and you have an active development team, then there's some really good guidance from Google and others on how to do a strict nonce-based content security policy for your application. And if you're starting your website from scratch, it's the perfect time to do it. But if you're doing virtual patching, you might not be able to do these changes to the application. So you might have to resort to a more traditional content security policy where you whitelist certain URLs and you say, only use JavaScript from our site and google.com, or other restrictions that you can set. The problem with whitelists is that you end up having quite a large whitelist of external resources that your site can use, and there's some that you need to avoid. So a lot of XSS attacks are due to inline or eval type script attacks, and for an existing application you might need to allow those because the application might already use inline scripts or eval. So sometimes it's quite hard to block those attacks using content security policy. And you might have to include third parties like google.com. And the problem is with external hosts is you don't necessarily know if every external host that you use is a safe one. So if I just jump through this talk quickly. So my website needs to use Google Analytics, which means I need to allow JavaScript from these 3 URLs. But some of these URLs and other Google URLs actually allow cross-site scripting attacks because they support JSON-P, which means that their script source will reflect back URL parameters and allow them to execute. So a whitelist-based CSP approach isn't necessarily the best one to use. If you want to dive into more, you can go and listen to that earlier talk, or you can Google for OWASP NZ Day 2019, how do I content security policy? And you'll find that the PDF of that pick a path adventure and the video of the talk. So in summary, I'm in wrap up now. Thank you very much for listening. The things I want you to take away from this talk is that virtual patching is a thing. So it's something that the security team can prepare for in advance, and you can add this tool to your tool belt when there's a security incident and you need to change an application before the developers are able to get it done. As I said, you should prepare the infrastructure in advance, and it completes this picture really. So we figured out how to build software securely, we figured out how to host it securely, we have third parties who can verify that it's secure for us, and virtual patching allows us to react quickly if there are incidents. So that's my talk. Thank you very much for attending, and enjoy the rest of the 24 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kirk. At this time, we are just about 5 minutes until the top of the next hour. So we'll be wrapping up here, and our next up will be hour 14, which will be presented and hosted by the newly formed OWASP Victoria chapter in British Columbia, Canada. We have one speaker there, Tanya Janka. She hacks purple, who will be talking during that hour. And we'll go ahead and sign off now so that everyone who's listening live can take a short break. And those of us who were just presenting here can go have lunch. Thank you all.